The words landed before the music did. "Dirty black boy, off my piano." Conrad Hess delivered them with the flat certainty of a man who had never once been told no, in front of 60 guests, a grand Steinway worth $400,000, and a 12-year-old child whose hands were still resting on the keys. The boy didn't move, didn't cry, didn't speak. He looked at Conrad Hess with eyes that were very still and very old for his age, and he lifted his hands from the ivory and placed them in his lap. Around the room, no one said a word. No one moved. Conrad turned back to his guests with the expression of a man who had merely corrected something minor, like a crooked picture frame. What he didn't know, what not a single person in that room knew, was what happened next. The boy placed his hands back on the keys, and what came out of that piano silenced every person in that house, including the man who just tried to silence him. 2 years earlier, here's where it begins. Isaiah Tate grew up in a third-floor apartment on Delancey Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the kind of neighborhood where the corner store had bulletproof glass and the elementary school had metal detectors, and the parents who loved their children most were the ones who stayed awake worrying about how to get them out. His mother, Renata, worked 12-hour shifts as a home health aide and came home smelling like antiseptic and wore the expression that women who carry everything wear, not defeated. Just compressed, everything packed down tight so there was room for the next thing. His father, Dennis, had been gone since Isaiah was 4. Not dead, just gone. A distinction that, as Isaiah got older, he understood was its own particular kind of grief. They did not have money. They had each other, and they had a keyboard. The keyboard had come from a church sale when Isaiah was 5. $60, one broken key on the far right end that nobody ever used. A power cord held together with electrical tape. Renata had bought it on instinct, had watched her son stop in the middle of the church gymnasium and stand perfectly still in front of the old instrument, while other kids ran around him, watched him press one key and then another and tilt his head the way he tilted his head when he was understanding something. And she'd spent $60 she didn't have on the feeling that this mattered. It mattered. By 7, Isaiah was playing hymns by ear at their church, reproducing full arrangements after hearing them once. By 9, he was sitting in on the adult choir rehearsals because the choir director, a retired music teacher named Mr. Aubrey, had pulled Renata aside after a Sunday service and told her with the directness of a man who had taught music for 30 years and knew what he was looking at. "Your son has a gift I have seen once in my life. Once. Please do not let it go to waste." Mr. Aubrey gave Isaiah lessons for free, 2 afternoons a week, in the back room of the church, on an upright piano that was older than either of them, working through scales and theory and the classical repertoire that Mr. Aubrey believed every serious musician needed regardless of where they were going. Isaiah absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, completely, quietly, without apparent effort, the notes going in and coming back out transformed. By 10, he was playing Chopin. By 11, he was playing Ravel. By 12, he had outgrown everything Mr. Aubrey could teach him, and Mr. Aubrey, who loved the boy and knew his own limits, said so plainly. "There's a program," he told Renata, "Young Artists Conservatory downtown. They take 12 students a year, all scholarship, and the teachers there are people I can't be." He paused. "Isaiah needs to audition." Renata looked at her son, who was sitting at the church upright, working through a passage of the Ravel he'd memorized, his eyes closed, his shoulders loose, somewhere else entirely. "What does the audition cost?" she asked. "Nothing," Mr. Aubrey said. "If they hear him, it won't cost anything at all." He was right. The Young Artists Conservatory offered Isaiah a full scholarship within 72 hours of his audition. The panel of 3 evaluators, all professional musicians with decades of performance and teaching experience, had sat in silence for a moment after he finished before the chairwoman, Dr. Elena Vasquez, said quietly to her colleagues what she would later say to Renata, "I don't know where this child came from, but he belongs here." Isaiah started that September. He took the bus downtown twice a week with his lunch in a backpack and his notebook full of theory work, and came home 4 hours later with the focused, inward expression of someone who had spent a long time in a place they were supposed to be. He was the only black student in the program. He was also, within 2 months, the most talked about. The other students were talented, carefully selected, technically advanced, products of years of private instruction and expensive instruments and the kind of early cultivation that serious musical training requires. Isaiah came from a $60 keyboard with one broken key and an aging church upright. He had no formal theory training before the conservatory, no competition history, no resume. He had the thing that can't be taught. Dr. Vasquez started him on the intermediate repertoire out of caution, to assess his technical foundation. Within 3 weeks, she moved him to the advanced track. Within 6 weeks, he was the student she lingered with at the end of sessions, the one she found herself preparing for differently, the one who made her remember why she had chosen this work in the first place. She told her husband over dinner one evening that she had encountered, in 30 years of teaching, perhaps 4 students with this quality of gift. He was a cellist. He asked what she meant by quality. She thought about it. Most gifted students play the notes, she said. Isaiah plays the thing behind the notes. He's 12 years old and he already knows where the music is trying to go. Aubrey came to see Isaiah play at the conservatory's winter recital. He sat in the 3rd row and watched his former student take the stage and do what he had always done. Disappear into the music, become it, make it seem not performed but inevitable. And afterward he sat in the empty hall for a long moment, his hands folded over his cane. When Renata found him, she sat beside him. He didn't speak for a while. Then, I was right. She took his hand. Spring came, and with it the Foundation's invitation to perform at the Hess House. Dr. Vasquez had hesitated, not about Isaiah, about the room. She knew Conrad Hess by reputation, which in the philanthropic world was sufficient. She'd attended one of his musical evenings 2 years prior and understood what he curated. Elegant, controlled, designed to reflect well on its host. She had wondered privately whether a 12-year-old boy from Delancey Street was prepared for a drawing room full of old money that had never once considered what it would feel like to sit in front of him. She decided she was overthinking it. She had seen Isaiah walk into spaces not built for him and fill them anyway quietly and without apparent effort, through the simple fact of what happened when he sat down at a piano. She told Renata about the invitation on a Tuesday afternoon. Renata was quiet for a moment. Will they treat him right? She asked. Yes, Dr. Vasquez said. She believed it when she said it. Conrad Hess had built the Hess Corporation from a commodities trading firm his father started into a diversified holding company worth $3.7 billion, and he had done it through a combination of genuine financial intelligence, total ruthlessness, and the particular social confidence of a man who had grown up wealthy, attended the right schools, married the right woman, and moved through rooms that were always arranged in his favor. He was 61, silver-haired, precise in the way that some wealthy men become precise. Not disciplined exactly, but controlled, every element of his presentation managed so thoroughly that spontaneity looked like performance. His home in Hyde Park was a statement. 12,000 square feet of restored Victorian architecture, original millwork, a wine cellar that an architecture magazine had profiled, and in the center of the West Drawing Room, a 1927 Steinway Model D concert grand, 9 feet of ebony lacquer, and hand-hammered hammers and $400,000 of the finest instrument ever built, which Conrad Hess played adequately at best and owned the way men like him owned things, for what it said about him rather than what he could do with it. He hosted musical evenings twice a year. The guest list was curated 40 to 60 people, old, money, and new, the kind of crowd that understood the language of a correct wine served with a correct course in a correct room. He usually engaged a professional performer, string quartet sometimes, a rising soprano from the opera company once, last spring a jazz pianist from New York whose name meant something in those circles. This evening, the Young Artists Conservatory had been invited to send a student performer as a community engagement initiative. The foundation that funded Conrad's charitable giving also funded a portion of the conservatory's operating costs, and someone on the board had suggested this would be a meaningful gesture. Conrad had agreed without particular interest. A student. Fine. Something to open the evening, 20 minutes, then dinner. When Isaiah arrived with Dr. Vasquez and Renata, who had taken the evening off work, exchanged her home health aid scrubs for a church dress, and sat in the car outside the house for a full minute before walking in, Conrad registered the boy the way he registered catering staff, as a function, not a person. The problem started before Isaiah ever touched the keys. He'd been standing near the Steinway, looking at it the way he always looked at a new instrument, with a kind of reverent attention, studying it. His head slightly tilted when Conrad crossed the room and saw where his attention was directed. Not what the boy was doing, where he was looking, and something in Conrad Hess, some combination of ownership and assumption, and whatever accumulates in a man who has been told all his life that certain things belong to him, crystallized instantly. "Don't touch that," he said, sharp in front of the room. Isaiah looked up. "I'm the performer this evening, sir. I know who you are." Conrad's voice dropped. The room had gone quiet the way rooms do when a powerful man speaks in a particular register. "You'll play when I tell you to play. And before you touch that instrument, I want to see your hands." Isaiah extended his hands, the hands that had been playing piano for 7 years, the hands Mr. Aubrey had called extraordinary. They were clean. They were the hands of a child. Conrad looked at them. "Wash them first," he said. "The kitchen is through there." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward. Her voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Hess, I assure you, this is my house," Conrad said. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Isaiah. And his voice, this was the part that Dr. Vasquez would describe later, in the board meeting where Conrad Hess's relationship with the foundation would be formally reviewed. His voice had no anger in it, no heat. That was the worst part. It was the voice of a man stating facts. And that is a $400,000 instrument. The boy washes his hands, or he doesn't play. Isaiah went to wash his hands. He came back. He stood at the bench. He waited. And then one of Conrad's guests, a heavy-set man in a blazer, already 2 glasses into the burgundy, made a comment to the person beside him that he may or may not have intended to carry. It did. Conrad's face shifted. A small, almost imperceptible movement, the edge of satisfaction. He looked at Isaiah at the piano bench, and he said what he said flatly without apparent malice, which somehow made it worse. "Dirty black boy. Off my piano." The room collapsed into silence. Isaiah's hands were on the keys. He looked at Conrad Hess. He looked at his mother, who had risen slightly from her seat, whose face, Renata Tate's face, which had carried so much with such compression for so long, had gone the specific particular still of a woman who was deciding whether to burn something down. Isaiah made the smallest, most deliberate movement. He turned back to the keys, and he played. What happened in the next 7 minutes was the thing people in that drawing room would spend years trying to describe. It was Ravel, Gaspard de la Nuit. 3 movements, the kind of piece that professional pianists prepare for years and perform with the knowledge that it will take everything they have. The kind of piece that separates the people who can play piano from the people for whom the piano is simply the instrument through which something else speaks. Conservatory students Isaiah's age did not play Gaspard de la Nuit. The piece was considered, even among advanced adult performers, one of the most brutally demanding works in the standard repertoire. Dr. Vasquez had assigned it to Isaiah 6 weeks earlier as a stretch goal, something to work toward over the next year. He had memorized it in 11 days. He played the first movement, Ondine, the water spirit, and by the end of the second page, the room was different. Not quieter because it had already been silent. Different the way a room is different when the temperature changes, when something enters that wasn't there before. The Ravel is built on a kind of shimmering instability, the upper register running like light on moving water. The bass underneath it deep and still. On a lesser instrument or under lesser hands, it can sound mechanical. On the Steinway, under Isaiah's hands, it sounded like what Ravel heard when he wrote it. Like water, like something alive and uncatchable and entirely indifferent to the person trying to hold it. There was not a person in that room who didn't feel it. Whatever they felt, however they would have named it, it moved through all of them. Conrad Hess stood where he had been standing. He didn't sit. His arms, which had been crossed, dropped slowly to his sides. His jaw worked slightly, barely perceptibly. He looked like a man whose body was receiving information that his mind had not yet been briefed on. Dr. Vasquez watched him from across the room. She had watched many audiences hear remarkable music for the first time. She had seen the progression before, dismissal to attention to something that wasn't quite recognition, but was approaching it, the way dawn approaches, from the edges first. She watched it cross Conrad Hess's face and felt no satisfaction, only a specific, exhausted sorrow for the distance between what this man had said 20 minutes ago and what he was experiencing now. By the second movement, Lejibed, the tolling bell, spare and relentless and profoundly sad, a single note repeated like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Two of the women in the front row were crying, not dramatically, just the particular stillness of faces working to hold something in. The man in the blazer had set down his wine. A man near the back of the room had bowed his head, not in prayer, in the way people bow their heads when something passes through them that they don't have words for. By the third movement, Scarbo, the demon, virtuosic and terrifying and technically merciless, the room had stopped being an audience. It had become something more exposed than an audience, a collection of people who had been caught somewhere private and couldn't look away. The Scarbo builds and builds, layers of complexity stacking until it seems impossible that a single pair of hands can manage all of it, and then at the end it breaks, briefly, into something almost tender before the final explosion. Isaiah played it the way he played everything, as though the music were simply telling him where to go, and he was following. He finished. He lifted his hands from the keys. Silence. 4 full seconds of it. Then the room broke open. Everyone was standing. Not with the polished enthusiasm of people at a curated social event, actually standing, actually responding the involuntary physical reaction of people who have been moved somewhere they didn't expect to go. The woman 2 seats from Renata reached across and put her hand on her arm. Renata's eyes were very bright and very level, and she looked at her son at the piano the way mothers look at their children when a private knowledge they have carried alone for a very long time finally becomes publicly true. Dr. Vasquez did not applaud. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching Conrad Hess. Conrad Hess had not moved. He stood in the middle of his own drawing room, in front of his own $400,000 piano, and his face had been doing something private and visible at the same time, something that had no name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 61 years certain of the correct order of things. And when the applause broke around him, he made a sound, not a word, just a sound, involuntary and small, and he sat down heavily in the nearest chair, as though his knees had made a decision his pride hadn't agreed to yet. Collapse was the word people used afterward. Not medically, not physically, though he'd been standing for a long time without moving. Just the particular way a person's architecture fails them when something has gone through all of it at once. Isaiah stood from the bench. He looked at Conrad Hess sitting in that chair, undone, reduced, older looking than he'd been 20 minutes ago, and he gave the small, clean nod of a performer at the end of a performance. Acknowledgement, nothing more. Then he walked to where his mother was standing, and Renata put her arm around her son, and she said something quietly into the top of his head that no one else in the room could hear. It didn't need to be heard. The Foundation's board convened 3 weeks later. The formal review of Conrad Hess's relationship with the Young Artists Conservatory took 45 minutes. The board had received a written account from Dr. Vasquez, corroborated by 11 guests who had contacted the Foundation independently, and one from Renata Tate, written in careful, precise language that said exactly what had happened and nothing more. The board voted to return Conrad Hess's most recent donation and sever the funding relationship. The letter was delivered by courier to his office on a Thursday morning. Conrad did not contest it. There were people who said he'd tried to apologize that he'd sent a letter to the conservatory to Dr. Vasquez, that he'd asked for Isaiah's address and been refused, appropriately, because a 12-year-old child should not have to process the regret of the man who called him dirty in his mother's presence. Whether the apology was genuine, whether Conrad Hess spent the following months understanding what had actually happened in that drawing room, rather than simply grieving the social cost of it, that is a question only Conrad could answer, and some questions are more important to ask than to resolve. 2 years later, Isaiah Tate, 14 years old, walked onto the stage of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra's concert hall for the Young Artists Conservatory's annual showcase. He wore a suit that Renata had bought him the previous weekend, charcoal gray, a little large in the shoulders because he was still growing. He sat at the concert grand, a different Steinway, the same language, and he adjusted the bench with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has learned exactly how to prepare. The hall held 800 people. Every seat was filled. Dr. Vasquez sat in the third row. Mr. Aubrey sat beside her, 90 years old, a cane between his knees, eyes bright and intent. In the fifth row, in the center, Renata Tate sat in the same church dress she'd worn to Conrad Hess's house 2 years before, because she liked what it meant now to wear it. Isaiah looked out at the hall for one moment, the collected breath of 800 people, the particular quality of silence that only exists when a room is waiting for something. And then he looked at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, and he played. The music filled every corner of that hall. Every seat, every held breath, every face turned toward the stage. It moved through the room the way it always had. Completely, inevitably, the way things move when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. In the third row, Dr. Vasquez closed her eyes. In the fifth row, Renata Tate did not close hers. She watched her son. The boy from Delancey Street, the boy from the $60 keyboard with the broken high key, the boy who had been told to wash his hands and then to step away from the piano, and then had played it anyway. She watched him and she let herself feel, fully and without compression, the particular joy of a parent watching a child become what they always were. The music went on, and the hall held every note.